Welcome everyone to the Liberation Lab YouTube, and for those folks joining us on LinkedIn, I am honored to have my guest. We're diving into a meaningful conversation around towards liberation, and so I want you to introduce yourself for people who have not been encountered your brilliance. Tell the people who you are, what you do, and why you do it.
Yes, just thank you so much for having me. Those are three really big questions. So I'll just start with my I am first, because I like to make sure that I'm not defining myself solely by the work that I do, but just simply the essence of my being. So I am Jamilah. I have the opportunity and the privilege to show up in this world and in this space as an author. I am the author of Toward Liberation Educational Practices Rooted in Activism, Healing, and Love. I am also a social entrepreneur. I founded an organization, She Imprints, and we serve at the intersection of wellness and justice for women and girls of the global majority, and also my educational consulting firm, Jamilah Pitts Consulting. And you said, why? Why do I do the work that I'm doing? Hmm. That is a really, really powerful question. I mean, I think it's a large part of just my why, my part of and my purpose for being on this earth is to elevate justice and liberation. And I choose to do that through wellness practices, through wellness education, and through traditional education in the K to 12 spaces. A large part of my why stems from my own lived experiences as a Black girl, as a Black woman, growing up in what I would say was an economically poor environment because it was rich in other ways. And also just as an empath and as someone who really sees people, holds spaces for people, it's incredibly important for me to do work in ways that elevates justice and liberation and ultimately humanity.
That is amazing, huge to think about in the sense because you said there that while it might have been economically disadvantaged, there was so much more.
Hmm.
Um, I want to take a trip down memory lane to start us off.
Hmm.
And I would love to hear about your K to 12 experience. I was saying this, as we were talking offline, and that is a lot of who we are as educators, as people dedicated to this work, gets framed or understood um, when we are coming through our K to 12 experience. And I'll say it this way: I know folks who kind of mastered, if you will. Uh, I know when to sit down at a certain time, how to raise my hand at a certain time. I learned how to be compliant, so on and so forth. And some of those folks turn out to be educators who then expect students to, if I did it, you should be able to do it. And so um, I would love to hear about your K to 12 experience. Talk to us about little Jamila.
Yeah, yeah. So I was really fortunate um, to have really powerful and impactful teachers, and I dedicate the book to my first teacher, my mother. And so much of the teaching and learning that I experienced happened before I even stepped within the traditional, walls or confines of a school building. And so there was a lot in my home around just celebrating the beauty of who I was as a Black girl without necessarily directly naming it, but it was, and the music that we listened to and, the TV shows or movies that we were encouraged to watch. My mom really birthed in all of her children really early on this love of reading and going to the library. Like we didn't have this opportunity to feel like reading wasn't something that was exciting or not cool. Um, my exposure to the arts happened really early. So K to 5, so all of K to 12, I went to public schools. I mean, that's what we could afford. But my
Right.
mom was really intentional about making sure that, if we had to go to public school, which we did not have a choice, making sure that we were in the best public schools in Columbus, Ohio. And so one of those schools was an a performing arts school. And so K to 5, um, or K to 4, I did not have a white teacher. All of my teachers were Black women, just really powerful, impactful Black women that really held me, that really encouraged me, that pushed me, that were just really great at their craft, but also did a really powerful job at understanding what Black children really need. And so I felt really loved in school. I felt really seen in school. And even the first white teacher that I had in fifth grade was also a really great educator. And so I remember in third grade, my teacher, asking us what we wanted to be when we grew up. My school was really big on asking about dreams, which I think is so
Mm,
important for young people, that we create that space and opportunities for young people to dream. And I remember at the time saying that I wanted to be a teacher because I loved school. And even as a child, I loved children and babies, and knew that I wanted to work with children in some capacity. At the time, I wanted to be a doctor, and I also wanted to be an author. And it's so interesting just looking at my life now, there's still so many of those through lines are still very present. But it was a space and an opportunity. Like, even though my world outside of school at times was really difficult and challenging, just in the spaces where I grew up, growing up in poverty, and a lot of the hardship and the ways that oppression shows up definitely manifested. But school was a safe haven for me, honestly, K to
mm,
12. I grew up dancing. I grew up in the performing arts. I grew up surrounded by educators who just really saw me, who saw my gifts and make sure that those were nurtured, and that I was nourished. And so it was a really powerful experience for me. But also, as I got older, closer to 12th grade and still wanting to move into the education space, I saw a lot of what was happening to my classmates,
mm,
children who I grew up with, people going to prison, losing folks really early. So seeing all of that and understanding very early that education is either going to be a tool for liberation or it's going to be a tool for oppression. And so it became very clear to me, how I wanted to move through and into education.
so as you contrast the stories and the narratives that you experienced yourself with those who you saw around you, how what are some of the most I'm going to say visible ways that you believe that influences you as an educator and how you show up? How do your K to 12 experiences kind of flow into that?
Yeah. So there were a few ways, and not all of them were positive at first. So I start in the book offering like apologies and naming the ways that I was not a perfect educator. There
Yeah.
was so much, especially as a Black educator that works with Black students, because of my lived experience and because of what I saw and how important I knew that school was, for Black people who are coming from neighborhoods the way that I did, there were times, especially earlier in my career, where I didn't lead and teach as much with like love and restoration, as I would have liked to, and that I'm able to reflect on now. I wasn't there yet in my practice, and so I like to be honest about that.
Mm,
I think I led more and I taught more out of this place of like, this world is really hard for people who look like us and who are coming from the experiences, that we're coming from. And so it is important that we're excellence. It's important that we show up in a particular kind of way. And I maybe didn't always communicate that or share that in a way that was um the most loving at times, even though it was coming from an incredibly loving place. Just understanding that, tough love wasn't something that always needed to happen, but understanding like early on in my career, that's a place that I was coming from. But I also would say the compassion and the drive that I had for education, and for working with young people, working with students of the global majority, particularly students whose backgrounds maybe looked very similar to my own. There was this really deep understanding of like, I get it. Like I
mm,
understand you, and I see you. and being able to teach and build lessons and build my units from this place of empathy and understanding. Being able to have conversations with colleagues and even leaders who maybe just, didn't necessarily see students in the way that I did. Having had that experience, it really, I never sat at a table and wasn't vocal. Like, I never sat at a table and didn't advocate for students. I never sat at a table and didn't tell the truth. Even if I was really difficult. I mean, even if I was going to be deemed, really difficult, or the different names that Black women are called, even sometimes by other Black people, because I had that lived experience and because I had a K to 12 experience. Um, that was able to push me and to nurture me and to nourish me simultaneously. My teachers still had really high expectations. They didn't pity us because we were coming from really hard backgrounds, right? And so it was this balance between really loving us through our educational experience, but also making sure that we had what we needed to excel, and to understand the power of who we are and the power that we hold within, understanding that making sure that we understood where we came from. And so
Mm,
a lot of things that I still carry with me and that I definitely carried with me, into the classroom and into leadership positions, um, throughout my tenure as an educator, for sure.
I think that, you know, I resonate with so much of what you shared. And I think that when it comes to, anytime folks share around their experiences and around what shapes them, I'm always appreciative of folks who will come up and say, I didn't always get it right. I still don't always get it right, because I think that sometimes perfectionism robs us of the journey and the process and the growth towards liberation, towards the things that we're talking about here.
Mhm.
Um, so let me ask you this. I really want to dive into your work and into your book, and you talk a lot about healing, which is really the focus of on my podcast, is healing and humanity for this season. And so I so resonate with that. You talk about this particularly from Black students who are in within systems designed to oppress them. Can you share more about how your personal journey and understanding has advocated for this healing approach within education? And first, also define it for folks, because when we say healing, some people might have varying understandings of what that is and what you mean when you say it.
Yeah, I think that definition is important, and certainly understanding that for different people, it may mean something different. And I do appreciate opportunities to pause and define language. One is just a former English teacher, but also when we are talking about terminology that's often overused, especially in education. We love our cliches and our buzzwords and our trending topics and words. And so healing and self-care are one of those things that, are really important, but sometimes when we overuse things or they feel really commercialized, we move away from the impact and the power of what we're talking about. So healing for me is deeply robust. It is this process of removing harm so that we're able to move to this place of wholeness. And so first of all, in my healing work, in my own healing journey, and in the work that I do as a healer, I start from this place of believing that we are already whole. I try not to use this language
Mm,
that we're broken in any kind of way. Um, but it is this process of removing and mitigating and uncovering harm and what hurts so that we can get to this place of repair, of restoration, and really tapping into that wholeness that exists. And so I can answer this in a couple ways. One, for me, I would not have been able to write a book like this or chapters that focus on self care and healing if it wasn't something that I'm currently living and that I lived. And so a part of it came from just moving through working in schools and understanding and feeling through the ways that teaching is really difficult. It really is a sacrifice. It requires all parts of you, all parts of your being, especially if you are doing a good job. Um, and the ways that I really felt like if I am not tending to my own self care, if I am not tending to my own well being, one, I am not going to be able to show up and be able to pour out and give to students because this work does require that. But
Mhm.
also, when I thought about, I'm a huge advocate of therapy. I started therapy when I was in graduate school. And so I moved into teaching under while I was going through therapy and just really
Mhm.
understanding the ways that my own lived experience, the ways that my childhood experiences have really impacted me. And so if I did not have that awareness, there are ways that I would be projecting and potentially harming students because perhaps I was still hurting in a lot of ways. And so that was a large part of it. I went through my yoga teacher training when I was still teaching. Actually, the very first class that I taught, I offered my students on my birthday, is it okay if I guide you in a yoga practice? And they all were like, absolutely, yes. And so it was this mirror work of as I have been moving through my own healing process, even still in the work that I do, and this platform that I've been given, as the natural teacher in me, as I am learning and as I explore, it feels very natural for me to teach and to give. And so all of the resources that I have amassed and that I use and that I have on my toolkit, I share in the book. I share it with students. I share with colleagues. I share with people that I care about. And there were definitely times in realizing, especially when I was writing certain chapters, of just feeling like I wish I would have had this awareness earlier, in my teaching career. Things could have looked differently. But forgiveness too is a part of the healing process. Yeah, and so for me, it was just very very much an exchange. Like as I've learned, as I've healed, and understanding that this is a lifelong process, I share that with others.
I I'm a little bit of a latecomer when it comes to therapy. And I can say, for myself, it is something I'd recommend for anyone, but particularly those of us in education. When you think about the ways in which we are shaping, molding, and impacting our babies,
Yes.
um, we must be very conscious of the ways in which our experiences show up, our um, whatever has impacted us, how that kind of materializes and shows up in the classroom. And, um, you know, for me, I saw it as because I've experienced and dealt with neglect, I tried very hard to be liked. And if you try very hard to be liked, sometimes you will compromise on standing firm on certain principles. You don't want to be unliked. You don't want people to think differently of you. And so then you acquiesce who you are
Mm,
for the approval of others. And I could definitely see that, particularly starting out in different roles that I've had in my educational career.
mhm.
And which brings me to my next question for you. You've served as an educator in various roles, right? Some teaching, coaching, an assistant principal. We were talking about that. Um, Talk to me about how those experiences and the various roles and responsibilities kind of shaped your view of uh, pushing towards liberation and things like that.
Yeah, I tried to pull from each experience that I had in writing this book. Um, I lean very heavily into teaching practices because I know that as practitioners, many educators have questions about, this is work that I believe in and I'm really excited about it, but how do I do that? And so I wanted to showcase and I wanted to share a lot of the work that I was able to do in the classroom with young people in um, in various roles and different types of schools to really just bring forward this point that, education is a really powerful practice. Teaching is a really powerful practice and platform. And there are ways that we can use what we have in our toolboxes as classroom teachers. There are ways that we can use some of the things that we already have within our pedagogical wheelhouse to be able to center liberation. And so there are examples that I point to in the book, but these were not things that I just made up as I was writing. I actually went through the archives of my lesson plans, my unit plans, emails students sent to me, letters students wrote to me, text messages students sent to me about different things. And I pulled samples of student work. And I pulled that into the book so that there is just this demonstration that like this is something that we can do, and it's something that is within the realm of what we hold and the capacity that we have as educators to be able to engage in this work. And in the same way, I knew that as an administrator, and I'm sure that you can, speak to this as well, our role looks, differently. I still did when I was an administrator and as a coach, I still did in most of the school places that I worked in, was still teaching. Um, but there are different ways that we can use our skill set, that we can use our impact, that we can use whatever it is that we have to leverage in our roles to be able to drive forward this work and to be able to center liberatory practices. So it was important to me to pull from all of those different aspects. And thinking about the various roles that I've held in education, it really cemented the work for me. It
Mm.
really gave me this holistic view, and I'm really able to use that now when I'm working with schools across the country to support educators, to support leaders, no matter what role they are in. There are ways that we all can do our part. There are ways that we all can show up. There are ways that we all can use whatever is in the wheelhouse of our practice, of our position, to be able to center liberation. And it's important that people have that blueprint. And so, if anything, it really gave me this full, robust understanding of the ways that we can utilize people and positions to be able to center liberation for sure.
You know, the aspect of being um, in school leadership, particularly as an assistant principal, I find that when you want to make a decision that you believe, that in your heart, in your gut, is going to move things forward in the cause for liberation, for your families, for your students, that sometimes it can be uncomfortable for those that you are leading,
Mhm,
because you're asking them to not only change their practices but change their paradigm.
mhm,
The last time that I was live with Dr. Lescott, and she said something very powerful that I know that you and I will both agree with. She said, "You can't call yourself anti-racist and all the things, the cliche words we talk about now. You can't call yourself any of that if you don't love, affirm, or even want to connect with the communities in which you serve."
mm,
And so much of what I find is when you look at um, those districts that particularly serve people of the global majority, you find that there is a sense in which educators will come in, grow and make their mistakes, and then leave and then go to some other district where they've now perfected or gotten better at their craft. And so the instructional excellence that we want to see for our babies sometimes isn't there as much or as readily. And the numbers tell us that, right? And so
mhm,
when you think about your teaching experience and you think about those moments in the classroom, what were some of the practical ways that you pushed for these practices, centering love and healing within the classroom, that you saw and said, you know what, this is something I'm going to take with me. This is something I hope everyone does.
mhm. Yeah, and before I get into some of the ways, I just want to speak to what you just named in terms of what we see often white folks. You didn't say that specifically, but I don't think you
I
had
did
to.
not.
But the way that white folks go, or people who are white minded, which when I say that, people get mad at me, but who, or folks who are upholding white supremacist culture, there we have a racist blueprint of that in various fields in this country. When I think about gynecological studies and practices, when I think about just what happened at Tuskegee, when I think about um, there is this historical and racist blueprint for just using Black bodies to study with, to play with, and then to go, elsewhere, or to just kind of leave wounded and move on. And so I wanted to name that. And now I've gotten off the question, and I said I was going to remember it. Well, what was it? You said, how did I use? Let me let you.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me also say, affirm that. Absolutely. Stamp that wholeheartedly true. Um, but in addition, like, so when we talk about the ways in which you sought to do that within the classroom, right?
Hmm.
I think that sometimes educators come, they might hear folks like you or I talk about these things and then say, "Well, I can't do that," or "I don't know how to do that," or "I'm not you," or and we come up
Hmm.
with our inner lawyer that defends us away from doing the work. And so I want to encourage folks and give them some type of resource to be able to take the first step if they have not already.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that I try to lay out in the book is there are some aspects and spaces where we do need to completely just like destroy, remove, and build something new. But there are some practices that we have that exist, especially within teaching, that we can use to center liberation. So, one of the things that I often do and working with instructional leaders, our classroom teachers, is using some of the language and some of the tools that we currently do, like essential questions, enduring understandings, right? Like you can take the the fundamentals of something like that, the tools like that, and be able to center liberation. There are ways that you can craft an essential question or use inquiry, which is a practice that we should be using in rigorous and really great teaching, to position students and to position ourselves as educators to think critically and lovingly about the world. I remember as an English teacher, an essential question that I crafted for students, both for a unit and for our entire year, is how do we use art, specifically literature, as a tool of resistance? And so everything that students read, everything that they studied that year was through that lens of art as resistance.
Mhm.
We can use our enduring understandings, right, which already set us up to use our content to really think about big ideas. What if we were to position ourselves to use our content, and we should be experts in our content, but that's a whole other conversation about why we're not able to center liberation if you can't even do the basic things that you were supposed to do, like how, anyway. So there are ways that you can use concepts, to ask students to think about, in math and science, to think about numbers, to think about money in a way that really highlights disparity, economic injustice, using sciences to encourage students to be innovators, to problem solve in their communities and in their world. There are ways that we can use literature to both study what has been written, but really focusing on like whose voice is silenced within the text. Why is their voice silenced, right? So there are so many different ways that we can use what we already have in our toolbox as educators, to leverage some of what I'm talking about in terms of centering liberation. In terms of text selection, there are ways that we can swap out some of these white canonical texts and really center diverse voices and voices of the global majority and experiences of folks who tend to be relegated to the margins of our communities and of our societies. And so often, what I hear from educators, in the same ways that we differentiate for students to meet their various learning, wherever they may be in their learning journey, we can also practice that as educators. For some of us, we might be ready to just completely say no to the way that we're being asked to teach if it's upholding white supremacy and shift. And then some of us, it might be starting a bit smaller, but understanding that that powerful change is still something, right? Like that small start is still something. So there are so many ways that we can do that. As an administrator, we can start to think about wellness and healing in terms of making sure that staff feel preserved, making sure that we're centering healing and joy in the classroom. Like, there are ways that we can do that in small ways and in really large ways. It's like you said, it starts with the mindset. It starts with the willingness to be able to shift and to be open.
I you know, part of the task is getting into classrooms and being present, and I try as much as I can to be there, and I feel like I've done a pretty fair job with that. And I was doing an observation to even today, and I walked into a classroom and there was a discussion about um, products and spending money and resources. And all I could think about is, as I was listening to the conversation, was like, we're not even talking about what happens when you work the same job, but you get less for the same work. We're not
Mhm.
talking about how, if you do, if you're from this context and this community, chances are, because of oppression and because of white supremacy and because of all the marginalization and othering of folks, this is what are some of the things that we experienced. Or even if the teacher said, all right, I'm going to give you all a um, you have on this sheet your salary, how much your net and gross pay, and he gave the men, all the young men, 70 cents to the women's dollar,
Mm,
and made that an eye-opening moment for what we could do and what needs to change in the real world, versus let's just talk about saving.
mm.
Like, there's ways that we can weave these things in
Yep.
without having to reinvent the wheel.
Mhm.
And so I'm glad that you named that for us. I want to
Yeah.
say, for those listening, if you just tapped in, I am talking to my sis Jamilah Pitts. She is the author of Toward Liberation. As we're talking, we're kind of unpacking her work. And so, if you are here with us, we'd love for you to jump in the chat, join the conversation. Um, and while we're here, I might as well say it. Go ahead and subscribe, like the video. Let's extend the reach of important conversations for folks. Got to do it. Um, but I wanted to ask you about, um, as we are in March and it being Women's History Month.
Yes.
Um, I think it was important for me to start um, any type of live, any type of thing, but centering the voices and the work of Black women. So thank you for accepting and being here. Um, Talk to me about not just the symbolism of this month, right? But like, talk to me about what this could mean, what it should mean from your perspective in our world, particularly as you walk through it and exist as a Black woman in our world.
Yeah, so it was incredibly important for me to have a Black woman on the cover of Toward Liberation. For
Mm,
me, I cannot talk about or engage in the work of liberation without understanding the integral and central role that Black women have played when we talk about liberation. I think just focusing on our experience, I think about the Combahee River Collective. I identify as a womanist, and uh, in talking about being a womanist, I think about the work of Alice Walker, who coined the term because the early waves of feminism did not include, but excluded the experiences of Black women. And one of the things that I talk about in my work and in Toward Liberation is when we focus on the experience of Black women and Black girls, liberation cannot happen if we are not pursuing liberation in a way that accounts for intersectional justice. And so, just our lived experience alone is really impactful and supporting us in achieving liberation. Racism in and of itself is incredibly important, and being anti racist is a part of or falls under the umbrella of what it means to center liberation. But if we're not talking about patriarchy, if we're not talking about sexism, then we leave out my lived experience, right? And so we don't get to liberation. We certainly don't get to collective liberation if if the ways that everyone is oppressed is not included within that. And so when I think about um, the Combahee River Collective Statement. Essentially, a part of that statement and that literature is that when we focus on the ways that Black women are harmed, by virtue and by nature of focusing on the ways that we are uniquely harmed within the world, within a society, across the diaspora, through that process, everybody is free because we then have to talk about the intersecting and the interlocking ways that oppression works and makes those of us who live at the intersections of multiple forms of identity and causes us to experience multiple forms of oppression simultaneously. By focusing on that harm, everyone becomes free in the process. So that is, one piece that I think is really important when we focus on Black women, especially. But I also just know that Black women are magical. And when I think about movements of resistance, particularly in this country, even though the civil rights movement, and I talk about and lean on Bell Hooks's work in the chapter on truth telling, we know that men did really powerful things in the civil rights movement, and we don't take away from that. But what we don't see is like the Ella Bakers and the Diane Nashes and Black women who were really central to making sure that this work happened, right? And so when I think about movements of resistance in general in this country, young people and Black women have often been on the front lines, including now, right? Including today. And so I when I think about this month, I think about my ancestors, I think about my grandmothers, I think about my mother, I think about my Spelman sisters, I think about just the magic of women and the role that we play within any society, within culture, the creativity that we bring, like quite literally the life that we give, if that is what we choose to do, in multiple ways, the ways that we sustain life in multiple ways. Um, when I think about the yin and yang energy, and I think about just feminine energy, which is not necessarily rooted in this male female binary that we like to think about it in a way that is really small. But I think about the power of rest and the power of creativity and the power of this energy that flows. It is life giving energy, it is a life giving source. And I think without women, and I think without Black women, especially in the ways that we show up, in the ways that we give, in the ways that we hold, in the ways that we love, in the ways that we care, I think so much of life ceases to exist without us. Um, and I have interesting feelings about these months that celebrate Black History Month and Women's History Month, because I think that we should be celebrated always. And
Mhm.
I do think the beauty of pausing to celebrate and to name, I think it gets us closer to this place of paying homage to those that we need to pay homage to, and certainly, Black women are just so very, very deserving.
I want to highlight a book that's behind you actually
Yeah.
as a piece that is transformative for me, and that is Dr. Monique Morris's book Push Out,
Hmm.
that talks about the ways in which our Black young girls are pushed out of our educational, our schools and things like that. And so, as I was reading it, she makes the point in the book in the beginning that we rightly so we talk about the unjust murder of Tamir Rice and how that went down, and rightly so we feel shock and awe about how that went down. But in that same park where he was playing was his sister,
Mm.
and that point always sticks with me because um, it's easy in a misogynist, patriarchal society to erase the contributions, the excellence, th- you know, all the things that women, particularly Black women, bring to the table. And you know, you don't escape from it even though you acknowledge it. So shout out to therapy and all the things for unlearning the ways in which these things kind of get into how you show up in the world and things that you need to be unlearning. So um
Mhm.
I appreciate you sharing that. In your book, you talk about kind of navigating this unjust system of education. And you talk about it from the aspects of activism and truth telling.
Mhm.
Um, Folks might hear those two things, one, and be like, well, what do you mean? I'm not an activist, or I might have a response to that. So I'd love for you to unpack that for us. And then um, when we think big picture, right? You put your love, your heart, your soul into this book. How do you see educators leveraging this text as both sword and shield into the educational battle for equity and justice?
Yeah, two really great questions. So I just don't think it's possible. And this is, my thought. I don't think it's possible to get to a place of liberation without activism and truth telling. This people just really love to lie and love to
Mm.
uphold and perpetuate ways of just lying. And so we cannot get to a place of being liberated with lies, right? And so, a part of our duty as educators, I believe it is our civic and human responsibility as educators to tell the truth, and even to reveal the ways that lies have been told and uphold, and who has benefited from those lies. And activism, I think is also necessary. And I do name early on in that chapter, I ask us to really think about what comes to mind when we consider activism, because I think that there tends to be this kind of generalized idea of what activism is and what it is not. But I think it's important that we understand that as teachers, there are unique ways that we can use our platform and our tools to be activists and to engage our students in that work alongside us, which I think is essential. In terms of how do educators use this work, use this book? Um, you said as a shield, and what was the other part? As a
Sword and shield.
the sword and a shield. Yeah. So when I think about the shielding aspect, I think about love and healing and self care. Because we have to be well, we have to be rooted in love, we have to be rooted in our why, we have to be sturdy in order to engage in this work, both literally and figuratively. And, I think about, I've often, I think, associated with truth as a type of sword. Um, I think that it can be really piercing, but it's also necessary when we're trying to get to the places that really should not be questionable for us as a society, the places that we need to get to as humanity. I understand that for some folks, and I was just having a conversation with someone that, you know, the, she asked me the question, Jemiah, like, why do you think that so many people are attacking this work and why it feels so harmful to them? And the truth of the matter is, you have a lot of people, and James Baldwin talked about this as well. You have a lot of people who have built their self worth, their identity, their love, their capacity to love themselves on relegating other people to the margins, on stepping on the backs of other people, on making other people small so that they can make themselves feel big. And so for some people, they're having an identity crisis and they don't know fully how to deal with that. And James Baldwin talks about that. And then you have, this work. And when we talk about truth telling and when we talk about activism, it means that we're now holding people accountable. And it means that we have to really truly look at ourselves. And if we're someone who's benefiting from harm, if we're benefiting from oppression, if we're benefiting from, keeping Black students and students of the global majority and schools that are just unspeakably awful and terrible in a variety of ways, someone telling the truth means that we are now called to task, and we're having to be accountable for that. And folks don't want to be accountable, folks don't want to be uncomfortable, and so in that way this work can feel really, really piercing, but it's something that we have to do anyway. But when I think about Cornel West's quote where he says that justice is what love looks like in public. And I think about the kind of shielding factors. Um, I think that justice, I think that liberation, to me, liberation and love are synonymous.
Mhm.
But I also think about the aspects of love that are tied to warmth, that are tied to care, that are tied to community, that are tied to our ability to continue and to move through and to move forward. Um, that really sustains us and grounds us and keeps us. And I think, this work is encompassing of all of those different things, because I think that in order to get to a place like collective liberation, we need the combination of all of it.
Mhm. You know, this the aspect of love, I think, is part of it is because we have very romanticized, I'm going to say,
Hmm.
um, definitions of what love is and what it means and how it moves and how it motivates and how it cuts. Sometimes we think kind of it as this passive agent, and love is active.
Yes.
And so I appreciate you, diving into that. You know, when you talk about activism, one of the things that I appreciate about your work is you you don't approach it, because most people think of activism, they think protests in the streets, hunger strikes, and things like that. And you present a more nuanced understanding of using your unique gifts and talents as a form of activism. Can you share a little bit more about that? And then how can educators begin to access what you're talking
Mhm.
about with these unique talents to begin to foster activism in and through their classrooms?
Yeah, I think it was really important for me to talk about activism in a way that felt more robust and more human, honestly. I think sometimes the way that we keep people out of movements and we keep people out of resistance, well, not we, the powers that be, is by showcasing something as like this one particular kind of way. And that's not how we get there. One of the things that I would do when I would study movements of resistance with my students or alongside my students is we would look at everybody's role. And I think that as human beings, again, when we talk about liberation that is collaborative and collective, we need everybody. And in the same way that in our body, different body parts and different organs have different functions, in a collective movement, in a movement full of bodies and various people, it's important that we tap into various gifts. So one, we avoid burnout, so that one, two, we avoid people doing work that they have no business doing. That's not their skill set. That's not their gifting. Not saying that they can't, learn skills. But even when I think about, so the civil rights movement keeps coming up as a reference. I don't consider the people who were nurses or the people who were making sure that people were fed, I don't consider them any less than
Mhm.
folks who were boycotting buses, or folks who were sitting in accounting meetings and really thinking about money, from folks who were really thinking about how we're going to get in front of legislators and policymakers, from folks who were giving speeches. Like, I don't see anyone's work as more important than anyone else's. And I think that in movements of resistance and activism, we really have to not move out of ego and pride, but really think about, we need all of us to be doing very different things so that the movement is sustained and so that
Yeah.
people are sustained. And so as educators, there are so many different ways that we can engage in activism. There are some educators who will stand outside with their signs and who will march, and that's fantastic. But we need all educators to understand, particularly classroom teachers, how do I use my curriculum and my lesson as a weapon, right? How do I do that? How do I engage what I have in front of me? How do I use what is already in my hand? Because we need people to be sustained in this work. One of the biggest threats to the movement, or any movement, is burnout and people feeling exhausted. And that is a tool of capitalism. That is a tool of racism. Let's exhaust you so that you can't, right? And so um, you know, there's some, when we are thinking about how to work collaboratively as opposed to this one or two people are going to hold all of the power, it's not effective, and it doesn't work. And so there's so many different ways that we can mobilize, that we can be creative, that we can use the different and unique skill sets that we have as educators to be able to engage in activism. And it is so necessary and it's important. And it's important that we remember that we have these really powerful co-conspirators, and that's the young people that we work alongside. And so when all of us are engaged in the work, we get a lot further together than if it's just like one or two of us trying to do the same thing, or 50 of us trying to do the same thing in a way that's really ineffective.
I think about like I said, the nuanced approach that you talk about and that you just shared with us, and how sometimes we place value on things that are kind of out there and in front, right? So somebody might
Yeah,
place value on someone who can speak and communicate and the gift of communication, but not necessarily the person who was behind the scenes and is a planner and organizer and can
correct.
make the thing go, right? And I think about that particularly, even practically speaking, like my bride, like she is behind the scenes. She's not the person that wants to be out front. She can do that. She
Hmm.
can, but she chooses not to exist in that space. But she is gifted, talented,
Yeah.
and extraordinary when it comes to that work that she does that just makes the thing go,
Hmm.
right? And I say that to say, folks might see, folks like you and I talking, writing out there,
Right.
and say, well, that's what it looks like. And it's like, nah,
Hmm.
there's
Hmm.
so much more. And I hope that folks listening to you get that, because you don't have to, it doesn't have to look like this. It doesn't have to
Hmm.
look like this one side. There's beauty and nuance and diversity for
Hmm.
how the movement is sustained and goes forward. And
Hmm.
if we're talking about the co-conspirators, aka the young people, the babies in our classrooms,
Yeah.
they need to see that nuanced approach, because not everybody's going to do it the same. And so by you
Mhm.
accessing your gifts, your talents, your passions, and learning with your students, like, hey, I'm learning this about myself, and then inviting them into that journey, man, what could that do for the next waves, right? The next JB, James Baldwin, the next um, Langston, the next
Yeah.
Fannie Lou, the
Yeah.
next, right? And so I I I I want to encourage us to think about things that way as well, because sometimes we kind of have one track minds when it comes
Yeah.
to this type of thing, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. One of my look to or model activist is actually Ella Baker. And the
Mm,
fact that we know her name and are able to speak her name is something that I think maybe she would not have wanted, because she
mhm,
was a strategist. She was someone, a lot of her activism and her work, even though she's not given all the credit, nor did she want it, was being behind the scenes, strategizing, mobilizing young folks, to make sure that the movement happened and was sustained. Rustin was a
mm,
strategist, and we're hearing his name more. But yeah, absolutely. Thank you for
yeah.
just speaking to that and raising that.
As we round out our time, I want to bring up a point that you said earlier, and that is and a central theme in your book, which is self-care.
Hmm.
And I want to present um kind of an aspect that I'm sure someone who is listening now and someone who will catch this replay might be thinking. When we think of self-care, typically it is this: let's bring in a couple folks to the school to give you a 10-minute back rub, or let's put snacks in the break room, the teacher's lounge, and don't get me wrong, some of those things are great,
Oh, for
but
sure.
that's what, right? Like, there's some of those things are great. um But I also think about something that Dr. Deanna Smith says. She says you can't self-care your way out of broken systems.
Mm,
And there is an educator who is listening now, or one who will catch this replay and feel like, I hear what you're saying about self-care, but you might not see what I'm experiencing here, or what I'm doing, or how I'm trying to walk out my passion, my gifting, and all of that in the place that I am in. So can you share more about, like, your personal journey in self-care amidst all of the challenges of teaching, leading, coaching,
mhm.
right? And how this journey's kind of influenced you, so that others could kind of glean from your lived experience as well.
Yeah, it wasn't easy. I mean, a part of why I resigned from working in schools when I was a school leader, I had never resigned from working anywhere my whole life. Um, was because my desire to care for myself was deemed selfish, especially as a school leader. And so I think it's getting a lot better, but it was really difficult actually for me as an educator because so much of what we praise in school culture is people who work all the time, people who work, over their weekends. Now, a part of it in this conversation is nuanced because, particularly in schools where they're predominantly Black students, predominantly students of the global majority that are highly under resourced, a part of the system, a part of oppression is you are working the people who are serving our young people to no end. And so, racism and capitalism have always walked hand in hand, always, in this country. And so I name that and I acknowledge that. But I also think about a mantra that I constantly come back to and that I carried with me as an educator, even when it was difficult. And it's the words by Audre Lorde, where she says that caring for myself is not self indulgence. Caring for myself is self preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. So that is one. In terms of my own journey, it started in ways that were just small. So I remember in my first couple years of teaching, I started to realize, listen, if I have pasta for lunch, I'm gonna have a really hard time with like my students that I'm teaching after, after my lunch break or after their lunch break. And that's not fair to them because I noticed what it did to my energy levels and just how food impacted my body. I noticed pretty early on, just as someone who grew up dancing, like I had to continue to stay in, and it was hard to find the time, especially when I had a ton of grading or I had a lot of different things that I had to do when I got home, as teachers do. It was difficult to find that time to make sure that I was pouring back into myself. But as I moved more deeply into the yoga practice, started teaching yoga, going on retreats, leading retreats. Um, my life, I adopted healing and wellness and self-care as a lifestyle. I made sure that I made it to my therapy appointments, my hair appointments, because that's self-care too. And making sure that I was spending time with like people that nourish me, making sure that I was in nourishing relationships, because all of that impacted how I showed up with my students. As someone who really and struggled when I was teaching with anxiety, just really understanding that there are ways that I really had to care for myself so that I could continue to do this work and even still. Um, and so when I talk about self-care in the book, I mention a lot of the things that I used, but understanding that I think it's helpful for all of us to think about this holistically, consider the work that we're doing, but also what we need uniquely as educators and as people, and making sure that we are in environments or that we are in spaces where, to the best of our abilities, because for some of us, maybe working under leaders like the one that I was, where it was just like, I'm being punished for trying to make sure that I am preserved here. And so it's been a lifelong journey. There was a lot of learning while I was working directly in schools. It's still a lot of learning in the work that I'm doing. Um, but it's necessary. Like, we cannot engage in work that is deeply humanistic and not take care of our own humanity. Like, it just doesn't even make sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, even if that means practically and, take that day off,
Mhm.
right? Like your students deserve the best you, and that is also a work of love that you choose not to put yourself in an environment where you can't be your best that day. Maybe you need a day, maybe you need a reset, right? So
Mhm.
prioritizing those things as well. So thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
Um, I want to publicly thank you again, as we round out our time, for sharing space with us, for your work, for the things that you call us to, right? Joy and activism and self care and truth telling, in your work. But I also want to give space for folks to connect with you. So, for folks who may not have known you and are now seeing you for the first time, how can they connect with you? How can they support you? Feel free to plug anything that is going on.
Yeah, so Toward Liberation is available everywhere books are sold. I like to plug supporting our independent bookstores, especially Black woman-owned bookstores, especially also Black owned bookstores and spaces. I know we talked earlier about just interesting relationships with social media, but I am on LinkedIn. I'm also on Instagram at Miss Jamilah Pitts. Also, I have my website, www.jamilahpitts.com. And yeah, those are the places that I can be reached when I am not in a space of solitude or caring deeply for myself.
Uh, Thank you for putting that boundary out there. That's huge.
Mhm.
Feel free, y'all, for those tapped in to connect with Jamilah, connect with her work. Please buy her book. I I would hold it up, but it's literally on my desk at work as I was reading it today. Oh, come on now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Hold that thing up for people. There it is. Please buy her book, Toward Liberation. Um, Wherever books are sold, but please support a black owned, black woman owned, if you can, bookstore as well. So thank you so much, sis, for sharing space with us. I pray and hope that you are recharged and refreshed for all that you gave us this evening. So thank you.
Yes, yes, likewise. Thank you so much for having me, especially after your very long full day. So thank you so much. We see
It
you.
was a day. All right, y'all. Till next time. Thank you so much for tapping into the Liberation Lab YouTube. Feel free to please subscribe, share, like, so folks can tap into this as well. All right. Till next time, y'all. Peace.